Howdy everyone, my name is Maran. Today we're exploring a place many of you have visited, the space between being awake and asleep. It's where your mind is conscious, but your body is locked down, unable to move or scream. This is the world of sleep paralysis. The stories you'll hear are real accounts from people who've stared into the abyss from their own beds. These encounters blur the line between nightmare and reality, leaving a unique horror that lingers long after you wake. The 3 stories we'll cover are some of the most chilling I've ever come across. So, turn down the lights, get comfortable, and prepare yourself for some truly disturbing tales. Our first story comes from Liam, a young man who had just moved into his very first apartment. It was a small, modest place, but to him it represented freedom and the start of adulthood. The building was old, with creaking floors and thin walls, but Liam didn't mind. He relished the quiet, the independence, and the sense of possibility that came with living alone for the first time. For weeks, life was uneventful, routine even. Liam would come home from work, make dinner, and watch TV before heading to bed. The city outside was always alive, but inside his apartment, everything felt safe and predictable. That is, until one Tuesday night, when everything changed. Liam woke abruptly in the dead of night. His eyes snapped open, but something was wrong. He was fully conscious, aware of his surroundings, but his body refused to respond. He lay there, trapped in his own skin, unable to move a muscle. Panic surged through him as the realization set in. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even call out for help. It was as if an invisible weight pressed down on his chest, pinning him to the mattress. His heart pounded in his ears and his breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. That's when he saw them. 2 tall, impossibly thin figures standing at the foot of his bed. They seemed to materialize out of the darkness, their forms barely distinguishable from the shadows that filled the room. These weren't just tricks of the light or figments of a half-remembered dream. The figures were voids, humanoid in shape, but utterly featureless, as if they were holes cut out of reality itself. Their presence felt fundamentally wrong, as if they didn't belong in this world. Liam's mind raced, desperately searching for an explanation. Was this some kind of nightmare? Sleep paralysis? But everything felt so real. The rough texture of the sheets beneath his fingers, the cold sweat beading on his forehead, the pale moonlight filtering through the window and casting long, eerie shadows across the room. The figures didn't move. They simply stood there, silent and motionless, yet their presence radiated a cold, malevolent energy that seemed to fill the entire room. Liam felt as if he were being watched, studied, judged by something ancient and unknowable. He tried to scream, to force out even the smallest sound, but his throat was locked tight. All he could manage was a faint, desperate wheeze. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the frantic beating of his own heart. Suddenly, one of the figures moved. It raised a long, spindly arm and pointed directly at him, as if acknowledging his terror. The gesture was slow, deliberate, and filled with a kind of dreadful intent that made Liam's blood run cold. The other figure remained perfectly still, a silent sentinel in the darkness. Its presence was no less terrifying, a constant reminder that Liam was not alone in the room. The pointing figure began to glide around the bed, its movements eerily smooth and unnatural. It drew closer and closer to Liam's head, as if preparing to whisper some unspeakable secret into his ear. The air in the room grew colder, each breath forming a faint mist in the darkness. Liam squeezed his eyes shut, clutching the sheets in a desperate attempt to block out the nightmare. He prayed silently, begging for release, for the figures to vanish, for his body to move. When he finally dared to open his eyes, the figure was looming directly above him. Its form was a swirling mass of darkness, absorbing every trace of light and hope from the room. Liam felt as if he were being pulled into a void, his very soul threatened by the thing hovering over him. The pressure in the room became unbearable, crushing him from all sides. Liam struggled for breath, convinced that he was about to die, that this was how his story would end, claimed by the darkness in his own bed. Desperate, he focused all his willpower on a single, simple action, wiggling his big toe. It was a trick he'd heard about once, a way to break free from sleep paralysis. He poured every ounce of strength into that tiny movement, refusing to give in to the terror. Suddenly, he felt a twitch. The dam broke. In an instant, he lurched upright, gasping for air, drenched in cold sweat. The figures were gone as if they had never been there at all, but the memory of their presence lingered, heavy and oppressive. Shaken to his core, Liam stumbled out of bed and turned on every light in the apartment. He checked every lock, every window, searching for any sign that what he'd experienced was real. He grabbed a baseball bat and sat on his couch, wide-eyed and trembling, unable to close his eyes for fear of what might return. The memory of those silent, watching figures haunted him every time he closed his eyes. Even in the safety of daylight, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the darkness was waiting for him to let his guard down. Eventually, the fear became too much to bear. Liam packed his belongings and moved out, hoping that a new place would bring peace. But the fear followed him, lurking in the corners of every dark room, whispering in the silence of the night. To this day, Liam often sleeps with a light on, unable to fully trust the darkness. He dreads that vulnerable place between sleep and wakefulness, terrified of what might be waiting for him in the shadows, watching, waiting, just beyond the edge of his vision. Our second story is Chloe's, a nurse who had seen her share of suffering and stress, someone who had spent countless nights tending to the sick and comforting the dying. She was no stranger to exhaustion, nor to the strange things that sometimes happen in the small hours of the night, but nothing in her years of experience could have prepared her for the evil she would encounter one fateful night, a darkness that was not just physical, but something far more sinister. After a grueling double shift, Chloe stumbled through her front door, barely able to keep her eyes open. She dropped her bag, kicked off her shoes, and collapsed into bed, her body aching and her mind desperate for rest. The world faded away as she drifted into sleep. But in the dead of night, something changed. She became aware. Her mind was awake, but her body was frozen, paralyzed by an invisible force. A crushing, suffocating weight pressed down on her chest, making it impossible to breathe. It felt as if something heavy and malevolent was sitting on her, pinning her to the bed. Panic surged through her veins. She tried to scream, to move even a finger, but her body refused to obey. She was trapped, helpless, her heart pounding in her ears. Then, from the darkness, the whispering began. Low, guttural voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They weren't just heard. They were felt, vibrating through her bones, speaking in a language she couldn't understand but instinctively knew was filled with hatred. The intent behind those voices was unmistakable. Pure, unfiltered malice. It was as if the shadows themselves had come alive, intent on tormenting her. The voices swirled in her mind, mocking and laughing, feeding on her terror. Every second felt like an eternity, the darkness pressing in closer, suffocating her with its presence. Chloe, a woman of science who believed in reason and logic, found herself utterly powerless. All her training, all her knowledge meant nothing in the face of this overwhelming evil. The weight on her chest grew heavier, the whispers louder, and the air itself turned icy and foul, as if she were breathing in the very essence of fear. She felt violated, as if something was reaching inside her, clawing at her soul. Tears streamed down her face as she realized she was completely at the mercy of whatever darkness had invaded her room. In utter desperation, Chloe did the only thing she could. She began to pray. Silently, in her mind, she repeated the Lord's Prayer, clinging to each word as if it were a lifeline thrown to her in a stormy sea. As she prayed, something shifted. The whispers faltered, their confidence shaken. The crushing weight on her chest began to lighten, as if the darkness itself was being pushed back by the force of her faith. Chloe clung to the prayer, repeating it over and over, her mental voice growing stronger with each word. She refused to let the darkness win. Gradually, the voices faded, their power waning. The pressure on her chest lifted, and the icy air began to warm as the first hints of dawn crept into the room. Suddenly, she could move again. Chloe bolted upright, gasping for air, her body trembling and drenched in sweat. She clutched her chest, trying to steady her racing heart. The room was silent, but the memory of the whispers and the suffocating weight lingered, haunting her in the quiet darkness. She glanced around, half expecting to see the shadows still lurking. Chloe never experienced anything quite that intense again, but she was forever changed. She became more aware, more cautious, and more humble in the face of the unknown. Some things, she realized, simply defy explanation. The terror of that night remains a chilling reminder for Chloe, and for all of us, that sometimes when we close our eyes, we are not as alone as we think. Our final story is a classic, the Old Hag Syndrome, a chilling phenomenon reported in folklore across the world, from the windswept moors of England to the humid nights of the Caribbean. For centuries, people have whispered about the terrifying experience of waking in the dead of night, unable to move, and feeling a sinister presence in the room. Some say it's just a bad dream, but for those who have lived it, the terror is all too real. David, a teenager, woke one night paralyzed. He was fully conscious, his mind racing, but his body refused to respond. The darkness pressed in around him, thick and suffocating, as if the very air had turned to stone. Suddenly, he felt a subtle dip in his mattress, as if someone unseen had perched at the edge of his bed. The sensation was unmistakable, weight shifting the springs, the faintest creak in the silence. Panic set in, no one else should have been there. His heart pounded in his chest, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an explanation. But the darkness offered no comfort, only the sense that something was terribly wrong. A weight settled on his chest, concentrated and suffocating. It pressed down with an unnatural heaviness, making every breath a struggle, as if invisible hands were squeezing the very life from his lungs. He tried to scream but couldn't make a sound. His mouth opened in a silent cry, his vocal cords frozen, his terror trapped inside him. The presence crawled up his body, slow and deliberate, as if savoring his fear. It moved with a dreadful certainty, positioning itself directly over his face, blocking out what little light remained. He smelled dust and decay, the stench of something ancient and long dead. The air was thick with the scent of rotting fabric and old, forgotten places, making him gag in terror. Then he saw her, an ancient woman, her skin wrinkled and pale as moonlight, her milky white eyes staring unblinking into his. Her face was a mask of age and malice, as if she had crawled out of a nightmare to torment him. Her grin was lipless, her teeth yellowed and broken, the face of a nightmare. The old hag. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, promising nothing but suffering. David was consumed by primal fear, pinned and helpless. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to fight, but his body was a prison, and the terror only grew as the seconds dragged on. The hag didn't speak, but radiated a predatory hunger, feeding on his terror. Her eyes seemed to drink in his fear, growing brighter as his hope faded. He felt his life force draining away, suffocating under her weight. Each breath was harder than the last, as if she was stealing the very air from his lungs, leaving him weak and desperate. In a desperate act, he focused on moving his finger. It was the only part of his body he could even hope to control, and he poured every ounce of willpower into that tiny movement. Nothing happened, until finally, a twitch. That small victory was enough to break the spell, to shatter the hag's hold on him. The spell broke. He gasped, his body free. The hag vanished, leaving only the echo of her presence and the pounding of his heart in the silent room. David sat shaking. The image of her face burned into his memory. He knew he would never forget those eyes, that grin, or the feeling of utter helplessness. The old hag has haunted humanity's nightmares for generations, a figure as real to those who see her as any monster in the dark. Whether a trick of the mind or something far older and more sinister, her legend endures, reminding us that sometimes the scariest things are the ones we meet when we're most vulnerable, alone in the dark, unable to move and utterly at her mercy. There you have it, 3 real encounters with the terror of sleep paralysis. From shadow figures to demonic whispers and the old hag, these stories show how thin the line is between our world and nightmares. These aren't just bad dreams, they're conscious experiences of helplessness in the face of something truly malevolent. Have you ever experienced sleep paralysis? Share your story in the comments below. Thank you for joining me on this chilling journey. If you enjoyed these stories, please like and subscribe for more tales of the strange and unexplained. Until next time, stay safe and try to sleep well.